I first want to thank you for coming on the podcast. I've been trying to do this for a while, but I think eventually the timing was perfect because now we have little bit of a break in the war, and this can allow us to perhaps have a better reflection of things.
Inshallah.
Inshallah. I want to start by saying that even though your book is primarily about Iran and its foreign policy, reading it has allowed me to develop a much better understanding of Lebanon and its own security and political struggles. There's a historic animosity between Lebanon and Israel, and the recent war in Gaza has really turned the question of resistance and its access into a very heated emotional debate where the binary is just good versus evil. And in this storyline, Iran has managed to do a psychological capture of the Palestinian cause, which is something you discuss in your book as part of its soft power. And with that, as you argue in the book, there comes a lot of gains. So I hope by the end of this episode, we can offer this audience a non-emotional source of information that can alter how people view and understand this issue. Can we describe the status quo of Iran in the region before October 7? What are the main keywords that illustrate this scene? And then we can go on from there.
So before October 7th, George, I would say that Iran believed that its axis of resistance, and the crown jewel of that axis of resistance was obviously, as you just mentioned, Hezbollah and also Syria. They believed that this axis of resistance created deterrence for it. And so it was viewed very differently from Tehran than it was viewed from Lebanon or from Israel, or which saw Iran's motivation as being offensive and aggressive. From the Iranian perspective, even though there was a bit of opportunism and offensive motivation, it basically, the way the Iranians saw it was its insurance policy against attack by the United States and Israel. And that obviously changed with October 7th, or at least with the aftermath of October 7th.
Something I really liked about the book is how you describe the way Iran engaged in diplomacy in the region, which is through a split screen. It dealt with failed states as opportunities where it can grow in their shadows. And Lebanon is a failed state, so is Syria. You also mentioned that Syria was Iran's only state ally, which is an interesting nuance to add there. But you also talk about how Iran dealt with more successful and sovereign states, which is even when there was hostilities, the end goal was always to achieve some sort of diplomacy. So basically, I just wanted to ask you about how the opportunities for Iran to really integrate itself in these failed states rose, and was Lebanon and Hezbollah the template that it followed later elsewhere?
Well, I think Lebanon and Hezbollah was the starting point almost, because as you know, Hezbollah was established around 1982, shortly after the Iranian Revolution, and in the beginning of the Iran-Iraq War. So in a way, what Israel did with Hezbollah, which started in 1982, is that by the time the Arab Spring occurred in 2010, 2011, and Syria fell into civil war, Iraq had been in civil war earlier after the U.S. invasion of 2003, Yemen fell into civil war, is it used its model, in a way, the model that it developed with Hezbollah, by creating these militia alliances in Iraq with the Hashd al-Shaabi, with the Houthis in Yemen, and then insinuating itself into the Syrian civil war. It used the model, the muscle memory that it developed with Hezbollah earlier during the Iran-Iraq War, to basically project power and influence into these states. But you alluded, George, to something else as well, is that in a way, what Iran was able to do, at least up until October 7th, it had this sort of strategic ambiguity, and that is that it projected power through these failed states as they fell into failure, during the Arab Spring. 2003 first, with Iraq, was a forced failed state, right, with the U.S. invasion. The other states, Syria, Yemen, fell into civil war. It used strategic ambiguity by having this sort of surreptitious, I call shadowy foreign policy, led up until 2020 by Major General Qasem Soleimani, from the Quds Force from Iran. But it also, at the same time, particularly starting in 2019, I had a little bit of a back channel, not back, but track 1.5 roll in the window onto this, was that Iran was starting to reestablish diplomatic relations with some of the stronger states in the region, as you implied, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and so forth. And that gave Iran a certain amount of strategic ambiguity, something that I actually discussed with the late Iranian president, Raisi, on 2 occasions, where I asked him about this. And he basically, the way he said this was that the militia strategy, the axis of resistance with Hezbollah, its militia alliances in Yemen and in Iraq and in Lebanon, and then obviously Hamas and the PIJ in Gaza, was a strategy of necessity, he believed, to create deterrence against what they saw aggressive intentions of the United States and Israel. But that the direction they wanted to go, the strategy of choice, was a strategy of moving much more towards traditional diplomacy with the strong Arab states. And obviously that whole thing collapsed after October 7th.
So was the intent behind this security architecture or the foreign policy, was it merely regime survival, or was there a broader ambition?
Well, there are some analysts that say that nothing Iran does has anything to do with the Iranian nation or with the state itself or the nation itself. It all is about regime survival, not state survival. I don't buy that notion. I do think that first and foremost is the regime, in the regime's eyes, is its own survival. But I think they conflate that with the interests of the state itself too. In other words, they believe that if the regime collapses, the state collapses, and that doesn't serve the nation or the people well, even though they've been at war with their own people to some degree since for quite a while. So I think it's regimes. I think a state can have multiple motivations in any of its policies. So regime survival, I would say, was number one. But I do think that they're also nationalistic. Many of the leaders of the Islamic Republic, late and current, are nationalistic, in addition to being focused on their own regime. So I think it's both.
So other than regime, if we can just go into details, other than preserving the regime's survival itself, what are some of the objectives that Iran was able to achieve through its proxies? And was the function only to deter and project power, or was there some sort of diplomatic leverage through conflict resolution that Iran could, create by sometimes destabilizing parts of the region and then trying to use that in order to achieve some regime or some foreign policy objectives?
Yeah, if you look at this through the Arab lens, and I spent a good bit of time in Saudi Arabia and Qatar, and in fact, I was just in Qatar just to cover the war just recently. But even before October 7th, I spent a good bit of time in the UAE and Qatar and Saudi Arabia. And if you look at it through their eyes, they used to say that Iran has captured 4 Arab capitals: Sana'a, Yemen, Baghdad, Iraq, Damascus, Syria, obviously before the Assad regime fell, and then Beirut, Lebanon. So from their perspective, this gave Iran was a hegemonic power in the region, even though it was really a poor man's foreign policy taking place in the failed states of the region. The Arab view was that this was a hegemonic regime. So you ask the question, did it buy them influence or leverage, or were they related? In other words, was the sub-state shadowy foreign policy, did it connect to the broader diplomatic initiatives of the Islamic Republic? I think, sure. I think it did. It certainly gave them a certain amount of leverage, and also to some degree pushed some of the Gulf Arab states towards a closer alliance with the United States, and at least for the UAE and Bahrain, with Israel under the Abraham Accords. So they are, I think the question, what you implied in your question is, are they connected? Is the state level, strong state foreign policy, more above, what I call above ground foreign policy, it's more traditional, was it connected to its surreptitious below ground shadowy foreign policy? I think it was.
You talk about the incident in 2019 when the Houthis attacked Saudi Arabia's Aramco oil facilities, how that sort of pushed Saudi Arabia into a rapprochement deal with Iran. So is this an example of how Iran would create conflict to then leverage the resolution part of that conflict?
In 2019, I met with Iranian officials, and it was very, very clear what their strategy was at the time. Because remember, this was 1 year after the Trump administration had renounced and walked away from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which was the nuclear deal. And what the Iranians were feeling at the time, a year later, was that they were under maximum pressure from the United States, and they believed that the Gulf Arab states, particularly Saudi Arabia, was encouraging Trump to impose maximum pressure on Iran. And what the Iranians did in a very calibrated way, and in a way that created some kind of plausible deniability, or maybe even implausible deniability, was the Houthis attacked the Abqaiq and Khurais Saudi Aramco facilities in Saudi Arabia. So it wasn't a major attack that would have precipitated perhaps a response from the United States, but it was an attack. And the idea was that it was to show that plus other actions was designed to show the Gulf Arab states, and particularly Saudi Arabia, which at the time it had no diplomatic relations with, to show them that the United States really didn't have their back, and that the Saudi Arabia could not hide under a U.S. security umbrella, and that they would have to do business with Iran, not in a coercive way necessarily, but to show that they lived in the neighborhood. The U.S. was a global power, and Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf Arab states were regional powers, and Iran was next door. And so the idea was to show them they could not rely on the United States, and that to encourage some kind of diplomatic track with Iran. And that did actually happen. It used enough pressure by attacking ships in the Gulf and the attacks on the Abqaiq and Khurais Aramco facilities to signal to the Saudis, that was their strategic logic, signal to the Saudis that they had to move towards a diplomatic track with Iran because they couldn't hide under the security curtain of the United States. Saudi Arabia is a regional actor and Iran's a regional actor, and they had to have diplomacy. Saudi Arabia could not just be an extension of the United States. And I think, and actually that's a very interesting point you bring up, George, because if you think about what's happening or what has happened just in the past few weeks, part of the logic, I believe, of Iran's approach to this war, which was to attack the Gulf Arab states that they had worked assiduously to build diplomatic, not alliances with, but relationships with, cold relationships with, but still functional relations with over the previous few years. Part of the approach was to use the Gulf Arab states as a lever to influence Donald Trump, create enough pain that for Donald Trump to de-escalate. But there was the other piece I think is very, very important to cover, George, is I think it's also an attempt to show the Gulf Arab states that the relationship with the United States is not a security blanket for them. In some ways, it's actually a boomerang that comes back and hits them because the United States will not protect them. So I think I don't know whether the Iranian leadership make the connection between what happened with Abqaiq and Khurais in 2019 or 2020 and what happened in March of 2026. But the logic seems to be the same, or the effect seems to be the same, or their intent. And I talked to a number of Iranians when I was in Doha, and they agreed with me that long term they believe that this would cause a strategic rethink on the part of the Gulf Arab states.
I wanted to address this towards the end of the episode, but since we're already there, one thing that I was able to conclude by myself by reading your book is to try to understand what Iran aims to achieve from attacking the Gulf so disproportionately. Almost 80% of all of the projectiles that have been launched from Iran have actually landed in the Gulf states and not in Israel. Of course, there's an element of efficiency there because trying to target Israel is much harder, is much more costly. There's an attrition there that is heavier. But also, I come to the analysis that perhaps the Iranians are trying to signal to the Gulf that should the regime survive, maybe an alternative way that they can think of their defense could be through some sort of integrated defense agreement within the region or with the Gulf, as to signal that a deal with us is always better than a deal against us. I don't know if this is kind of the long-term thinking. You definitely nailed it on the short-term objectives, which is try to transfer pressure through attacking the Gulf. And we can also here talk about the nuance between the attacks on the UAE versus the attack on Saudi Arabia, given that they have a split in the region. But do you think Iran is trying to bring the Gulf over to its side when it comes to some sort of defense and security, should it survive?
Well, I think the first motivation of the Islamic Republic under attack is just survival. I don't think they're in the mode necessarily of thinking, particularly in the early days of the war, thinking too far ahead in terms of bringing the Gulf Arab states into some kind of an alliance. I think the Iranians probably and are more nuanced than that, George, in the sense that I don't think they believe that Saudi Arabia, Qatar, or UAE are going to join any kind of alliance with the Islamic Republic. I do think that there, at the end of this war, there will be discussions about what kind of security architecture for the region, not for Iran alone, not for Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain, Qatar alone, not for Israel alone. There will be questions as to how to stabilize this region. But I think in terms of motivation, no, I think what the Iranians believe will happen is that at the end of this war, they will have burned through a lot of equity with the Gulf Arab states, even Qatar. I was actually in Qatar, in Doha, when there were at least 100, within 2 or 3 weeks I was there, at least 100 attacks. Some of them, most of them were intercepted, but 100 attacks, but there were several that were not, into an industrial zone close to where I was staying, and also the attack on the Ras Laffan gas terminal. And so I think the Iranian view is that the Gulf Arab states are furious with Iran because they were non-protagonists in this conflict. They were trying to dissuade Donald Trump, we believe, from launching this war because they knew what was going to happen. It was very clear what the Iranians were. This is classic Iranian playbook. So they knew what was going to happen, which is why they tried it. So I think the Iranians believe, as furious as they are, the Gulf Arab states are with Iran, that at least from the Qatari perspective, and I'm not speaking for them, it's just my impression, is at the end of the war, there will be an understanding that they have to deal with Iran in some way, that there will have to be some, over time, it may take time, but a rebuilding of diplomatic ties and connections with Iran. But the bigger picture, I think, for the Iranians is that the Gulf Arab states will have to at least reconsider and rethink their relationship with the United States, and at least for Bahrain and UAE, perhaps even Israel. And I don't think that the Gulf Arab states have too many alternatives to the United States, frankly. And I don't think China is they're a partner, but it could be a partner, but not a security partner. So I think they realize that they're kind of wedded to the United States. But within that assumption, I think there will be some hedging that goes on, a strategic rethink. And how that relates to your question about some kind of a security relationship with Iran, I don't see Iran believing that the Gulf Arab states will move into their camp, to the Iranian camp, in sort of a bandwagoning kind of approach. No, I don't think that's going to.
Is Iran trying to insert itself in some post-war security architecture? The way I will use your wording because it's better.
I don't know, George. I don't think they're thinking that far ahead. I think the first order, what we call first order effect, is to put pressure on the United States, and then for the United States to put pressure on Israel. But I think the effect of this, and talking to Iranians that I met in Doha, suggest that there will need to be some kind of a reconciliation between the Gulf Arab states and Iran, and some need to broaden that into some kind of a security architecture that takes into account the interests of all states in the region. That's about as far as I will go in terms of, because I don't think the Iranians can afford right now to think too far ahead, given that they're facing this sort of existential crisis.
How do you explain the nuance in distribution of attacks across the Gulf? And is there some sort of relation between the disproportionate attacks on the UAE and its first rivalry with Saudi Arabia, but second also close alliance with Israel. Is UAE a pressure point that hurts the most in this region, you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is aimed at the what I mentioned before, is that since the UAE and Bahrain in particular have this relationship with Israel under the Abraham Accord, I think part of it is to suggest, hey, you create an alignment with our enemy, and now our enemy is attacking us and has decapitated our regime. You're going to pay a price for that. So part of it is that. Part of it is because of the U.S. assets there and the targeting has, the targeting U.S. even though it was targeting civilian targets and hotels and things like that. I think it's that piece. Qatar, I think, which has gotten quite a few hits as well, was a harder call for the Iranians, I would imagine, because they obviously share the underground gas field, and because they've had reasonable relations with Qatar. So I think there is a differential based upon how they see the attitudes of the UAE and Bahrain in particular towards Iran and towards its enemy, Israel, towards Iran's enemy, Israel. So I think there's a piece of that. And I think there's a piece that the differential with Oman and obviously Qatar, I think, suggests that they are differentiating their targets based upon the ease of thinking about the day after the war, thinking about how they can work their way back. Even though the biggest attack was against the Ras Laffan gas terminal, that was a quid pro quo, I believe, because the Israelis had attacked on the Iranian side of that. So I think they are differentiating between them.
I'm gonna move to the nuclear issue. A lot of people I talked to had doubts that Iran actually has ever really wanted to pursue a nuclear weapon, and they believed that creating the nuclear program was sort of had more of a strategic purpose in itself rather than the end goal, which is to reach a nuclear weapon. Do you believe there was an ulterior strategic motive behind the nuclear program that was not just to eventually reach a nuclear weapon?
Well, I think there's a strategic piece that I'll address in a second. But I think there's also the nationalistic piece, and that is that Iran's prestige, that this was a nuclear program that was started under the Shah. The early days of the Islamic Republic had kind of languished, and then the Iranians believed, as they developed their threat perception and so forth, this was going to be a wedge or a lever to use, not necessarily as a weapon, not necessarily the development of a weapon, though they did have a weapons program, a secret weapons program going back to about 23 years ago to 2003. But I think they saw it from a prestige standpoint, that they are a member of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Israel is not a member, is not a signatory country to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. They have the right to enrich. They don't have the right to develop a weapon, but they have the right to enrich. So I think the way they saw this as time marched on, and as they became more focused on the United States and Israel, I think they saw enrichment and the ability to move up the scale towards more of a threshold capability towards a weapon, but stopping short of a weapon, as part of the deterrent architecture that it had. Marrying that up with its missile program and its axis of resistance, what we talked about earlier with Hezbollah, Hashd-e-Shaabi, Hamas, and the Houthis. So I think it started as a sort of a nationalistic project, and then in prestige, and it moved into a part of a strategic architecture, which now has been called obviously into question.
Do you think at some point the Iranians knew that they would never actually reach a nuclear weapon, but that this could be one way to get them to lift the sanctions? Did the Iranians create the nuclear weapon and the nuclear program just so that they can negotiate on it?
Well, if that was the case, it was a boomerang, because many of the sanctions came about as a result of the nuclear program. So no, I don't think so. I think it was, what happened later on. So yeah, I guess the answer is yes and no, George, now that I think about it, because initially no, because it invited sanctions. I think what Iran did is try to use time to its advantage by accelerating the program, the levels of enrichment, or increasing the levels of enrichment. That, I think, was designed to put pressure on the international community to suggest that time was their friend and not the U.S.'s and Israel's friend, and that the more enrichment that was created, moving closer to becoming a threshold state, would put pressure in order to get sanctions removed. So I think it was a double-edged sword for the Iranians. It certainly invited sanctions. In fact, 2011, the first time the U.S. was able to get the United Nations behind Security Council to pass not just unilateral sanctions, but actually multilateral sanctions. And that was largely because of Iran's nuclear program. But they also, within that context, used the pace at which and the levels at which they were enriching to put pressure on the United States and the international community to negotiate with Iran. So I think it was both.
I'm going to move to the post-October 7 timeline, and I want to ask you, why did it take Iran almost a year to directly get involved in the war? So just to give a little bit of context, October 7, there's the Hamas attack on Israel. It unleashes a war. A day later, or less than a day later, Hezbollah unilaterally initiates some sort of low-intensity engagement with Israel across the Lebanese border. Israel responds. This becomes a back and forth. Then, almost 8 days later, after Hezbollah opened its front, the Houthis in the Red Sea also announced that they will be joining the war. It doesn't become a global shipping issue just yet, but by late November, 4 fronts would have had opened, including militia Zaira, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. So. I believe that up until perhaps the summer of 2024, Iran was the one sort of managing the war and the pace of the war without getting directly involved. But I think it was mid-September, that the dynamics completely switched. This is when Israel, within the span of 12 hours, took out Fuad Shukr in Beirut, which was Hezbollah's #1 military commander, and then Ismail Haniyeh in a guarded facility in Tehran. So it takes Iran almost a year to decide to enter the war on a state-to-state level with Israel, and almost 2 weeks after Israel had struck a consulate in Damascus.
Damascus, yeah.
Yes. So my question is, why do you think Iran decided that it wanted to abandon this safe buffer that it had and directly enter the war with Israel?
Well, I think it believed that it had completely lost deterrence, particularly after the attack on the Iranian consulate in Damascus, Syria. So I believe that the strategy of its axis of resistance was, as you suggest, was to create a buffer and a deterrent, have a deterrent effect against attacks by Israel and the United States. The October 7th attacks on Israel by Hamas, and then the attacks that occurred in Damascus, Syria, is it indicated to the Iranians they had completely lost deterrence. So I think they believe that that Israel now had, in some ways, the same strategy or the same doctrine that Iran had, which was forward defense, that Israel was now going to become increasingly aggressive. So I believe the Iranians believed that they were forced into, their hand was forced. It wasn't so much that they waited a year. I think I don't think they intended to enter a war with Israel at that point, but I think they believed that the risk of doing nothing and staying passive after the Damascus attack would have cost them more in terms of deterrence than responded. And they did respond. They responded in a very, as you know, a very measured way. 2 weeks in advance, they telegraphed what they were going to do. So it was a measured, careful response, trying to not necessarily enter the war. I wouldn't phrase it that way. I would say, there's a continuum of war that was there, but I think the Iranians believed that they needed to recreate deterrence. I don't think they necessarily wanted to start a continual war with Israel at that point.
In retrospect, we know that Iranians did not indeed recreate deterrence through this attack. If anything, it drew them closer into a war, and it played into Israel's hand. Do you believe that this is, I read in the book that you described that the strategy, that Iran's regional strategy failed the moment its proxies sort of drew it into a war, which is the opposite of what they were designed to do. They were designed to protect it from having to fight a war on its own terrain. But so is this the moment you believe that the Iranian regional strategy failed and backfired?
Yeah, I do. Because I think the whole notion of forward defense, which was the basic doctrine that emerged out of the Iran-Iraq War, which is let me give a little context. So the Iran-Iraq War from 1980 1988, the Iraqis came over through Khuzestan, right, through the Arab, we call the soft belly of Iran. It's the same route that we believe that the Arabs and the Islamic invasion in the, like, what, 6th or 7th century used. It's the same route that Alexander of Macedonia, Alexander the Great, used. So I think at the end of the Iran-Iraq War, and it was the same route that Saddam Hussein used. So I think at the end of the Iran-Iraq War, Iran believed that it could not really protect the homeland unless it projected power beyond the homeland. And so that was the whole notion of forward defense, which was we're going to project power into some of the soft belly of the Arab world in order to protect the homeland. Well, I think it was clear, but so the idea was to keep Iran out of the fight, right? To keep the homeland protected. Well, after October 7th, the strategy it used for forward defense to give it strategic depth became a boomerang and hit Iran back. And that was the attacks on the axis of resistance, and then the attacks on the consulate in Damascus signaled to Iran that its strategy had failed at that point, or it collapsed.
So how does Iran try to salvage it, in your views? Or is it too late?
Now or after it?
At that point.
I think between the attacks on Damascus and the first two rounds between Israel, that were basically between Israel and Iran, I think Iran understood that its deterrence, particularly after the attacks on its anti-missile program and its missile deterrence systems by the Israelis in 2024, I believe. I think the Iranians believed that they had lost deterrence at that point. They lost the axis of resistance had been compromised, and their conventional capabilities had been compromised. Well, I'm not sure if they believed it was a point of return, but I think they believed that going back to the old days, going back to trying to resurrect the axis of resistance. Remember, the axis of resistance worked, George, because the Israelis had been at that point, up to October 7th, had somewhat been deterred by the axis of resistance. So once the Israeli red lines changed, the whole security calculus changed. So I don't think Iran believed they could resurrect the same edifice of deterrence they had before with the axis of resistance. So they knew they had to do something different. But they were coming up short, obviously. So I think that's where the danger came, that Iran might at some point move towards a mad dash to a nuclear weapon. They didn't do that. They hadn't, to our knowledge, they didn't make that decision. But I think they realized that their missile capability, conventional capability had been degraded. Their axis of resistance had been degraded. The Israelis were much more aggressive. Their red lines had changed. So I think they believed, particularly coming in after the 12-day war, when it wasn't just between Israel and Iran, it was between Israel, Iran, and the United States. Between Iran and Israel and the United States, they believe they had completely lost deterrence. And when I met with President Pezeshkian twice, including just last September, he indicated that. He indicated that Iran knew that another war was coming. Pezeshkian was surprised it had not occurred. This was September of last year. He was surprised that between June and September, another attack hadn't occurred. So they were quite aware that they had lost their deterrent. And they were getting ready for the next war. And they prepared for this war. They knew it was coming. They believed it was coming after 9/11, frankly, when the U.S. went to Iraq and Afghanistan. They started planning then. But they supercharged their planning effort after the June war of last year. And that brought us up to the current moment when we see that the resilience that Iran has shown is as much damage that has been incurred. They've shown a lot of resilience. Much of that resilience, some of it goes back to 9/11, the aftermath of 9/11, and a lot of it goes back to the planning that took place after the June war of 2025.
At that point, did it become inevitable that a all-out war with Iran would come out as a result of a loss of deterrence? Or was it a choice that the Israelis and the Americans could have or could have not made?
Oh, I think, of course, it was a choice. I mean, the Iranians believed it was coming. They believed there was an inevitability to it because of the pattern of the June war and the pattern of Donald Trump's animosity and bellicosity towards Iran. starting back in 2018 when Trump in the first term withdrew from a nuclear deal that was working and was operating. So they believed it was inevitable. Do I believe that it was an inevitability given Iran's lack of deterrence? No, because there was an implicit deterrence that Iran had in terms of its ability to wage conflict in the Gulf Arab states, which was the Gulf Arab states very much tied into the United States. So, and also the implicit or the latent capability to block the Strait of Hormuz. So Iran had deterrence. They believed that there was no deterrent effect. They had the tools, ultimate tools of deterrent, but they believe that given the mindset of Bibi Netanyahu, Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel, and the mindset of Donald Trump, that war was inevitable. Do I think it was inevitable given that Iran had lost deterrence? No, I don't. I think it was the folly of the United States and Israel, and frankly, a change in the complete mindset of the United States that made that choice an inevitability.
So if we go back to the way Iran reacted after when it was attacked, which is, as you described, which is it diffused the war across the region and it tried to maximize the cost of the war by going after America's and Israel's allies in the region and then giving it a global dimension by blocking 20% of oil trade through the Strait of Hormuz. Didn't the Americans and the Israelis see it coming that Iran would behave this way? And if so, did they believe that they could still overcome it? So I'm trying to see if there's a mismatch between expectations when it came to war planning and the simulation of how this war would go versus the real-life result of how the war has actually gone.
Listen, I mean, any of us that looked at Iran and studied Iran and knew Iran could have predicted the path that the Iranians took. And not only Iran analysts knew that. The Gulf Arab states knew how Iran would react if it faced an existential crisis. If it faced an existential crisis, it was going to do its best to inflict as much pain on U.S. allies in the region as it could, not because they were necessarily trying to injure the Gulf Arab states, because the Iranians knew that there would be a cost to doing that, right? What we just talked about earlier, which is in their relationship. But the Gulf Arab states knew that was going to take place because that would be the most proximate way for Iran to put pressure on the United States. So any of us who studied Iran knew that. In fact, I was actually was interviewed by Le Monde, I think before the war started, and I pretty much said it that way then. So anybody that knew Iran knew that. So why the United States or Donald Trump didn't know that, I don't know. Either he was given intelligence that he didn't understand, he was given intelligence he didn't listen to, he didn't remember. I can't get into Donald Trump's head. But I can tell you that the National Security Council within the White House, which is sort of like an inside coordination and also think tank within the White House, used to have all that expertise that would be funneled to the National Security Advisor, which in this case would be Secretary of State and National Security Advisor Marco Rubio, and would work its way to the President of the United States. That institution has been hollowed out in this administration, and also the State Department. Was used to be lots of institutional expertise on Iran. I can't tell you that there's no expertise at all, but it's either been sidelined, purged, or completely outside the decision-making process, because this administration seems not to value expertise. So the Strait of Hormuz, the response that Iran took to the Gulf Arab states, which were kind of a playbook. I mean, there was George, was wargaming going on for the last 20 years, I would say, within the Defense Department. Those war games showed that if Iran was attacked, what it would do. Now, didn't predict exactly what Iran would do, but the Strait of Hormuz was clearly a potential leverage point for the Iranians. And the fact that the Gulf Arab states had U.S. bases and had relationships, close security relationships and economic relationships with the United States was part of that war game. So the notion that somehow the White House didn't know or didn't predict, no one told them, that's just it's just not plausible. So frankly, if that was the case, then shame on the President of the United States.
I want to build on the phrase that you used, which is can violence erase politics? Because one of the main questions that I would like to explore with you in this episode is whether enough force or enough military defeat to the Iranians can force them ultimately to drastically change their foreign policy. But I will scale back the question to start. I will start by asking to which degree is foreign policy related, is Iran's foreign policy related to its military capabilities in the region, whether conventional or unconventional, whether state-owned or proxy? How much of their maneuvering margins is afforded to them by those military capabilities, by the ability to destabilize across different parts of the region, deter, and then project force?
I think most of it, and that's if you look at some of the protests that occurred in Iran, the Iranian people believe that too, that most of its foreign policy, going back to 2017, 2018, Iranians were saying, why are you protecting Syria, the Assad regime in Syria, and we're suffering under sanctions and under economic deprivation. So I think the belief was that Iran had become a securitized state, and therefore most of its foreign policy was geared towards its militarized, or its, I would call it asymmetric militarized foreign policy. And going forward, you're probably going to see even more that's the case because it's been under attack. So I'm not sure if that was the question you were getting at, but if you could, we can develop it further if you'd like.
So my question is, do you think the Israelis believed, and the Americans, that if they destroy all of Iran's regional security deterrence, can force it to alter its foreign policy?
No. I think the Israeli perspective was that this was a regime that could not be redeemed, that they were going to collapse the regime, and they were willing to accept something the Gulf Arab states were not willing to accept, which was an Iran that maybe went into civil war or collapsed. And that out of that collapse, either would come a regime that was more pliable, or the state would collapse and Iran would no longer pose a threat to Israel. I don't think they had one bit of thinking that they could use military force to shape the strategic options of the current regime. Not at all. They're going to have to do that now, or they're going to have to be thinking in that way now because it looks like the regime is going to survive. So you're not asking whether I thought military means could collapse, end politics by the regime collapsing. You were asking the question, using military means to shape behavior.
Yes.
The answer, I think, George, lies in the fact that if you go back to, I think, one of the original sins that brought us to this point was the JCPOA was a evidence that the behavior of the regime could in some ways be changed, be altered. There was economic sanctions, so there was pressure applied, and by the United States, by the international community, sanctions. And there was a recognition that once the United States said Iran has the right to enrich, but the question will be to what level of enrichment. Once they entered those negotiations, they saw that the regime was willing to make adjustments and change its behavior. The 2018 Trump withdrawal from the JCPOA, I call it the original sin, is that it basically said, we're going to, even though Iran is complying with the deal, even though Iran seems to be not necessarily changing its regional behavior, but the main issue, at least for the United States and Israel and the Gulf Arab states, which was their nuclear program, that Iran had already changed its behavior. And that wasn't enough for Israel and the United States. They believed that by applying more pressure and ultimately using military force in 2025 and now 2026, they could get the Iranians not to change its behavior, but to capitulate, either capitulate completely. That's not a change of behavior. That's a collapse of Iran's strategic capacity, or that the regime would collapse. So I think they had no belief that they could alter the regime. And frankly, they had no interest in it, because I think Israel saw Donald Trump as a willing partner. And so even if they could have shaped the behavior of the regime, they had no interest in it. This was a project of Bibi Netanyahu for the last 30 years.
I want to go back to the nuclear deal that you mentioned, the JCPOA, to talk about what exactly was the behavior in Iran that this deal aimed to alter. Is it just the journey toward nuclear enrichment to the degree where it could develop into a weapon, or was it because you mentioned you nuanced the regional behavior from the nuclear program? Did eventually this deal allow Iran to grow even more powerful in the region, you think, through having, first of all, perhaps legitimized its support to its militias, and then ultimately allowed it more money and resources to put into groups like Hezbollah and the Houthis and others?
Well, that's the argument, I mean, isn't it? That's the argument of the Trump administration. It's the argument of the Israelis, is that the whatever sanction relief they had achieved between 2015 2018, that all that did is didn't change Iranian behavior. It changed Iranian behavior only on the nuclear file, a very narrow file, but it gave Iran cash and ability to not change its regional behavior, but actually speed up or accelerate the behavior that it's already on. You know something, George? Listen, strategy is never a certainty. It's a bet on the future. So when Barack Obama launched the JCPOA or forged the JCPOA, not just with Iran, but with also the other permanent members of the Security Council, we have 3 members plus Germany, it was a bet on a long-term future. It wasn't a bet that Iran was going to change its behavior in the region overnight, because its security environment hadn't changed overnight. So I think it was a bet on a longer-term future that we could do business with Iran. And after some goodwill gestures and a period of investment and so forth, that slowly over time, there could be some kind of a movement. It was never a bet that after the deal was signed, Iran would change its behavior. Listen, Iran didn't need. Iran accelerated its support for its militias when it was under maximum pressure sanctions. When Donald Trump in 2008 walked away from the nuclear deal and imposed the most punishing sanctions, including secondary sanctions on countries that might deal business with Iran, Iran doubled down on its support for its militias. So I don't buy the notion that somehow this was a deal with the devil. The JCPOA is a deal with the devil. It may have been a deal with the devil, but I don't think it was a deal with the devil that somehow prompted it to accelerate its regional activities, because the theory of the case could never be proved out. It was too soon to prove whether the bet on the future that Barack Obama made could have, in the medium to long term, changed Iran's behavior. We don't know. It's a counterfactual.
I want to take a moment to talk about the impact that Iran's support to its regional militias have on states like Lebanon. You mentioned them as being failed states, and one of the main struggles that we have today, and which is what I try to do through my platform, is to raise awareness about why Lebanon hasn't managed to a sort of rise in the last 20 years. Even though, it was 20 years ago when we had the last occupation on our land leave, which was the Syrians in 2005. 5 years prior to that, the Israelis had withdrawn from the south, and that came almost 15 years after the end of the civil war, which began between 1975 and 1990. So I think that up until the year 2000, a lot of Lebanon's struggles with formation and with independence were related to really organic, natural consequences of the regional war and the spillover into Lebanon. But after 2005, which is when the Syrians left, it stopped being a natural outcome of regional upheaval, and it started to become something very much more, targeted and coerced and structured, which is the violence that killed politics in Lebanon. And I know we talked earlier about whether violence can kill politics for the Iranians. Violence did manage to kill politics in Lebanon. In Lebanon, violence didn't become the continuation of politics. It simply removed politics from the equation. And between the year 2005 and 2006, and then 7 and 8, Hezbollah really grew into becoming the most the hegemon over the country, larger than the state itself. And then it became a regional problem, not even a local problem. So, do you think it is possible? So I want to take a step back. First of all, why do you think the Iranian regime, in its mind, cannot survive with its militias, and why it's very unlikely for them to abandon support for their militias?
Well, I think in the current moment, I think the concern, aside from the fact that Hezbollah has been Iran's crown jewel, I think the concern is that if they would abandon Hezbollah in some kind of a grand bargain with the United States, that should the war continue, should the negotiations collapse and the war continue, they might not be able to rely on other militia alliances with the Houthis and so forth. So I think it's important for them in the current moment not to abandon these alliances. It's going to be very interesting, George, what happens after the war in terms of these alliances. Will the Iranians believe that they serve a purpose, continue to serve a purpose for Iran? Will they slowly attenuate over time? I think it depends upon the state of these militias at the end of the war, and I think on Iran as well. So it's not clear to me how Iran will reconfigure a security architecture going forward. I think it's going to be, it's got some opportunities going forward, and it also has constraints. Where the militias, including Hezbollah, will play in Iran's calculus once the war is over and once the dust settles, and Iran has to rebuild, and rebuild not just internally, it has to rebuild, it needs to need external investment for sure, in some way in order to reconstruct. Where then the axis of resistance fits, it's too soon to tell, George. Some would say, well, it's going to become less of an appendage of Iranian foreign policy. The relationships will exist, but it will not be part of the security architecture. It'll be much more of a slow, over time, Iran will attenuate those relationships. It's interesting, George, in the book, I look at another case of a country that was extremely aggressive regionally and also very ideological internally, and that was Vietnam, and how Vietnam made a transition. So and I use that in the book to say this is the least likely, this book was written before the war, obviously. It's the least likely but most interesting scenario for Iran is how will Iran transition from being a regionally sort of have a shadowy foreign policy in the region through the militias? Will it be able to transition to a more conventional foreign policy? And I think your question it has to be considered in that bigger context. How does Iran's security architecture develop?
But is it completely up to Iran whether it continues to maintain these militias? Because the way the war is developing in Lebanon, it's clear that the existence of Hezbollah is no longer tenable or accepted. Neither is it internationally, nor is it regionally, and of course, surely not internally. So I think a lot of the decision or the choice on whether groups like Hezbollah, at least I'm going to speak about the Lebanon's case, groups like Hezbollah continue to be allowed to operate is no longer just up to Iran. There's really a war that Israel is waging that is trying to weaken Hezbollah to a large degree, but I don't think it can be a zero-sum game. You cannot completely uproot Hezbollah through airstrikes. There's also local decision-making that is gearing towards some sort of direct negotiations and potentially a peace track with Israel that could be accelerated. This also feels a bit surreal, but as you mentioned in the book, 10 years before the formation of the European Union, the idea also seemed unattainable. But if Iran's existence in the underbelly of the region depends on these states being failed states, then Iran is also invested in keeping these states as failed states. So there's a certain part of the region that Iran will always deny the ability to rise and self-govern properly as long as its security investments are integrated within them. And I really hope that when we come out of this war, and this is a personal, just wishful thinking, this situation stops being accepted by all of the actors involved.
I think you make a very good point. That is, this is not that that Lebanon and Iraq and certainly they have agency, right? There's a certain amount of agency. Look, the biggest the only state actor in the region that had an alliance with Iran was Syria, and it collapsed, right? The Assad regime, it was an alliance. So you're absolutely right. It didn't collapse because Iran gave up on Syria. It was collapsed because of internal decay and so forth that allowed al-Shara and his group to take over. So you're absolutely right to look at the capacity of the states themselves and the agency of these countries that host these militias as part of the question of what happens going forward. I do think it begs the question of the strategies of some of the Gulf Arab states and the United States. I mean, I remember meeting with the Saudis. I mean, and I actually interviewed Haider al-Abadi, the former prime minister of Iraq, lengthy interview for my book, where he described exactly the fact that the former prime minister Maliki wanted, I know we're getting away from Lebanon, but it's a parallel, that Maliki went to Riyadh and asked the Saudis to stay involved in Iraq. And basically, the Saudis, under the former king, King Abdullah, basically said Iraq is lost to the Iranians, and therefore you're a puppet of the Iranians. We're not going to deal with you.
This is also in the book, which you say is a strategic error, perhaps.
Right, it's a strategic error. It ceded control to the Iranians by default, and I think to some degree the Saudis made. And you're a better student of Lebanon than I am. So we can argue this. It's fine. I remember I was asked when I was at Georgetown to participate in a project, Saudi-funded, U.S.-supported, to help build up a war college for the Lebanese Armed Forces, LAF. I don't know where that came. The initiative I was working on fell apart, but part of it was the Saudis basically had this, to my understanding, and you can refute this because you know more about Lebanon than I do, that part of it was that the Saudis had the same view about Lebanon that they did about Iraq, and that this was kind of not a lost cause, but kind of a lost cause. They weren't going to support because they believed that anything that they gave into Lebanon would go and benefit Iran. And you saw that with the strong arming of Hariri, right, by the Saudis.
Yes.
Push. So I think part of this has to do with Iran, but it also has to do with failure of diplomacy, failure of the United States, and failure of the Arab states. How that then plays going forward, I don't know. But that, I think, is an important piece of what has transpired with Iran's control over these states.
The example you gave about Saudis also pulling out of Lebanon because they feel that whatever they put in is also going to benefit Hezbollah. I mean, I don't see it as far-fetched because Hezbollah became so integrated within the Lebanese state and really became the decision maker over issues of national security. So even was able to influence the decisions of the Lebanese army as well. So I think every institution in Lebanon, had Hezbollah not gone to war with Israel in 2024 and suffered such defeat, Lebanon would have likely ended up being a lost cause to Hezbollah and Iran. I think
you're saying that the Saudi calculus, it may have been short-sighted, but it wasn't wrong. Because
I think it wasn't wrong because from my perspective, Hezbollah had total control over Lebanese institutions. It was fully integrated within the Lebanese deep state, within state institutions. It controlled the political dynamics internally. It made sure that no credible opposition ever rose. And even the groups that were opposed to Hezbollah were in bed with Hezbollah within the political system and had shared financial, economic interests. So Hezbollah really did manage to build two things in Lebanon. It kept the state sort of afloat just to the point that it can give it a little bit of cover and stability, but it made sure that everything parallel to the state was more powerful. The parallel militia was more powerful than the army. The parallel generator providers were more reliable than public energy sector. The same for basically every service in Lebanon that should have been provided through the state had a parallel provider to it, including security. And the parallel always was stronger than the original, but Hezbollah was integrated and controlled both. And this is why I think had Hezbollah not suffered a massive defeat in 2024 and now, then Lebanon might have never been able to rise from collapse. I would like to ask you a bit of a fun question. If you were, to start wrapping up the interview, if you were writing the final chapter today, rather than having published it a year ago, do you think it would be easier for you to narrow down sort of the possibilities that Iran had to face? And would you have imagined it playing out this way?
Well, it's a great question. I mean, I certainly couldn't envision necessarily. I think, end the book talk about the potential for greater Israeli and American aggression against Iran. And I do say that Iran, which seemed to have an over-reliance on its relationship with Russia and China, that would be an over miscalculation on their part. I think that proved to be true. I certainly couldn't predict necessarily the June war of last year, this year. I think if I was writing the book now, if I was writing the conclusion now, I think I would say that the crossroads that I believe Iran was going to face, which was they were going to have to make a choice at some point between their above ground, I call it, foreign policy of diplomacy versus its below ground foreign policy of alliance with its militias. Those things seem to coexist well, because as I said, when I met with President Raisi and others, they said, well, one is a strategy of necessity, the militias, and the strategy above ground of diplomacy with the Gulf Arab states was a strategy of choice of where they wanted to go. And I said, eventually those things will clash. They're not going to be able. I think I say that in the last chapter of the book. I didn't envision that would happen so quickly, and I think if I were writing the last chapter now, I would say that Iran's options will, at the end of the war, in some ways have opened up more options than they had before, and in other ways will be much more constrained and narrow. And what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that we know that leading up to this war, the Iranian regime was challenged on two fronts. It was challenged externally because the regime knew they were going to be attacked again. They didn't know when, they didn't know how, but they knew they were going to be attacked again. So they externally, they were challenged. They were boxed in, so to speak. They knew they lost deterrence. And they were boxed in, they believed, by their own people, epitomized or exemplified by the protests that occurred in just earlier this year that were brutally suppressed. So they knew that, right? But they didn't have anywhere to go because Ali Khamenei was not going to change foreign policy direction in any significant way. It was not going to change its death to America, death to Israel kind of a foreign policy. And it really didn't have anywhere to go in terms of building legitimacy. I mean, Pezeshkian said that. We can't solve the problems that bedevil Iran economically and so forth. So the question is, what does that mean now? It means that there's going to be not a regime change, but new leadership. They're going to have choices to make. I don't think they can rebuild Iran without creating some kind of new understanding with the Iranian people. Very difficult to do. But I think that they're going to try to, I would imagine, I'm projecting out, imagine that they're going to try to stimulate nationalism, something that's been in some evidence since this war started nearly 2 months ago, tap into that and create some kind of new social contract with the Iranian people. They're not going to open up politically. They're going to be brutal against any political dissent. But I think on some of the cultural dynamics, the hijab and so forth, which had already loosened up, I think they're going to pick their battles and try to forge a new path forward. And in terms of internationally, they don't have a lot of choices, George. I mean, assuming that there's some kind of a non-aggression pact, that they won't have to worry about if they believe they've recreated deterrence, which is the ultimate objective of the Islamic Republic right now, is to recreate the deterrence they lost before. They're only going to end this war if they believe they've recreated that. That's why we see the back and forth now occurring between the U.S. and Iran in the Strait of Hormuz and in the Gulf of Oman. If they've recreated deterrence, they're going to have to make some hard choices, assuming that the international community will allow for it. They're going to have to make some hard choices. I don't believe they're going to be able to rely only on a tilt east strategy of Russia, and they're going to need investments. They're going to need sanction relief. They're only going to end this war if there is sanction relief, and they're going to have to build upon that with relationships with the West in some way. So I think that if I were writing the last chapter now, I would say that there's an opportunity for Iran to take a new path because it's new leadership. If they end the war, if the war ends soon, they will have recreated deterrence. They've solved that issue. They have an opportunity to recreate relationship with the Iranian people, and they're going to be an imperative to rebuild, get investment in there at some point. So I think there's an opportunity for Iran, even though they could go the other way. I mean,
so we can have regime change without having regime change.
You can have behavioral change without
yes.
regime change. Yeah, you have to, right. I mean, in a way, the Iran has denied the United States and Israel of its ultimate war objective, which was to bring down the regime.
Do you think both the US and Israel ultimately had the same end goal out of this war?
No, I don't think they were. And first of all, any two allies, if you look at the Great Britain and the United States during the Second World War, the longer the war went on, the more it was difficult to manage their disparate goals and relationships. No, I think going into the war, I don't think the U.S. had a goal, frankly. I think it believed that it'd be a 4-day war, the regime would collapse, and therefore that's what I call the elimination of politics, right? They thought they could just sort of eliminationist approach. No, I think the United States at this point wants the war to end. I think the global costs, reputationally and financially, are going to be imposed upon the United States. They won't be imposed upon Israel. Israel's goals were much more finite, much more clear, much more regional. It was basically to eliminate the regime, eliminate the threat they saw. I think they're going to be deprived of that in some way. But I think that for the United States, it's bring this darn thing to an end and do it in a way that Donald Trump can claim some victory. So no, I don't think the goals going in were the same. They were hidden beneath the, listen, if you're going to end the war in 4 days, if the war's going to be a 4-day war, that can hide a lot of potential disagreements, right? Because the war will end. But the longer this has gone on, it's very clear that the United States and Israel don't have the same objectives.
My final question, if you allow. If we look at how Iran has drew regional legitimacy and influence, it always has to do with some degree of destabilization. Use the word spoiler effect. It's always the regime that's able to spoil other things. It was able to destabilize other states. It's able to block off the Red Sea. It's able to now block the Strait of Hormuz. So destabilization, or this sort of like negative power projection, always seems to be Iran's main source of influence. In this attempt to trying to imagine a new future for how Iran could evolve, do you see an equation of Hezbollah for Hormuz, which means basically letting go of the leverage that the regime draws from its regional actors and instead looking for opportunities that are closer to its own geography, that are less costly? I mean, Iran has paid tens of billions of dollars in its regional security network, and evidently it was the Strait of Hormuz, which was there all along for free, that gave them the greatest source of power when they needed it. Do you see a way where Iran could abandon abandon the allies without abandoning the model? So the model still relies on its ability to spoil and destabilize, but rather than doing it from cost-heavy militias that end up eventually actually drawing Iran into a war, rather than deterring it, they could do it perhaps by geography and through the Strait of Hormuz.
I think this notion of using the Strait of Hormuz and sort of capturing it, try to establish a toll structure. I don't think that's I don't think that piece is survivable for them. I don't. I think it'll burn through equity with China. I think it'll certainly make it almost impossible to repair relations with the Gulf Arab states. I don't think that's survivable. I think that's used now in order to try to generate income. But do I think that Iran can transition to a new model of deterrence? I think it's found that the nuclear weapon, in a way, is not a nuclear weapon. It is the Strait of Hormuz in some ways. But I think there's something else going on here, George, I think is important to point out, is that Iran has to be careful about not overplaying its hand. Because here's the way I see it. This is more from a personal perspective. Who have been the ultimate spoilers here in terms of the global economic community and in terms of even regional stability? Has it been Iran now, or is the big spoiler been Israel and the United States? And if Iran doesn't overplay its hand, it might be able to become the little spoiler versus the big spoiler of the United States. And I think that's what they're probably relying on with the Gulf Arab states, is that their Gulf Arab states are going to see, yeah, Iran can be a menace, but the real destabilizing influence has been, through this war, has been Israel and the United States. So I think Iran can position itself into a new, have other potential spoiler points without playing the role of spoiler. I don't think it can afford to play the role of spoiler going forward, but it will maintain those tools that it can use to act as a spoiler. And if you're asking, can the Strait of Hormuz replace the axis of resistance? I think it's on a continuum. I don't think it's one or the other, but I think yes. I think there's going to be a rethink. There was already a rethink after the June war. I saw it close up, of the Iranian regime. And I think after this, I said when I was in Doha, I said that Iranian leaders always learn from the last war. The generation of leaders that have been in power for the last 38 years, the Iran-Iraq war ended in 1988, so 38 years ago, they took their lessons from that war. This group of leaders are going to take the lessons from this war. And this war, I think, are going to be that there's some opportunities for Iran to position itself differently reputationally, and have the capability to act as a spoiler without acting upon that role every day, given the fact they've got a little bit of air cover from the United States and Israel.
Ironically, it's always the US that is creating these opportunities for Iran, even when it is through war with Iran.
That is, I do address that in the book, that Iran has built that's a good place to end, because Iran has built its strategy of adaptation, or its skill of adaptation, on the mistakes of others. Failed states in Syria, fragile states in Lebanon, a mistake the US made in Iraq by collapsing the regime. And it has been able to parlay those mistakes into something for itself, not necessarily for the Iranian people, but for itself. And the question becomes, how does it take, assuming we see this as a mistake, this war as a mistake, how does it take this moment to engineer a strategy for itself that wins on the backs of missteps of others?
Professor Harrison, thank you so much for this interview, and thank you so much for this book. This has been an amazing book, and it's almost surreal that I got to interview you about it and about the region right now. And I hope if you're ever in Beirut at some point, I would love to do this in person.
I have some very good friends in Lebanon,
Yeah.
and so I'd love to come to. I always tell my friends that they really don't want me to come, because every time I plan on coming,
something happens.
So,
I mean, it's really not you. It's us.
Oh, okay. Well,
don't worry about it. So thank you so much for this interview, and I'm looking forward to seeing, of course, how this situation eventually gets resolved. Is there anything you would like to add before we wrap up?
No, I wanted to. If the listeners are in Lebanon, I listen. The Lebanon is an amazing country in many ways. I mean, the spirit of Lebanon, the vibrancy of Lebanon, the history of Lebanon, incredible suffering that Lebanon as a country has had has been a tragedy, but it's also, I think, in some ways contributed to the resilience of your country. You know, I had dinner with a friend, an unnamed friend, a number of months ago, and that friend wanted to move from New York City back to Lebanon, partially because he said, you know, there is something about living in a state that is struggling for its own survival. There's a vibrancy, there's an electricity, there's a capture, there's a
It's romanticized.
yeah, in some ways so my hope is that at the end of this war, that there will be an understanding that this region cannot continue on the old rickety structure it existed before. That it was put together. It had this unstable equilibrium because of this rickety notion of deterrence. That there will finally be an understanding that the region needs a security architecture, including the interest of all states, the fragile states and the stronger states, and that this region will move, including with Lebanon, move into a better future as other regions have moved from war into peace, such as Southeast Asia. So that's my hope for Lebanon and my hope for the region.
Thank you so much, Professor Ross. It's been amazing.
Thank you, George.